Welcome back to Classics Abridged, where we are going through the Caroline Alexander translation of Homer's Iliad. Last time, the strong-grieved Achaeans had finally marshaled for war and started to head for Troy. Oh, and before we start, my script here is reminding me that I should ask people to like if you like the video, comment if you want to tell me something, and subscribe so you know when I put out new videos. Alright, let's get to it. The third chapter starts with the armies advancing on each other. The Achaeans in silence, while the Trojans howl their war cries. As they pause to face each other, a Trojan champion emerges, a man with the body of a god and a leopard skin cloak around his shoulders. He carries a sword and 2 spears as he challenges the best of the Achaeans. From the other side, Menelaus, brother to Agamemnon, recognizes this as the man who had so grievously offended him years ago and now brought Greece and Troy to war. And so Menelaus, beloved of Ares, goes tearing through his own forces to reach the front and answer the challenge. And this godlike figure that opposes him flees immediately. Yeah, that is how we find out what kind of man started the Trojan War. Paris. No, not the city. Paris Alexandros. You may recall me mentioning previously that Paris insulted Hera, which is why the Queen of the Gods wants his entire civilization wiped out. Paris is also the reason for the whole Trojan War in the first place. See, the offense that he gave to Menelaus was stealing his wife, the incomparably beautiful Helen. As for why that caused the Trojan War, we need to step back a bit. Helen is the daughter of Zeus and Leda, which is probably the source of her great beauty. She was actually kidnapped as a child to be taken as a bride, and then rescued by her brothers. Once she actually was of marrying age, she had suitors from everywhere in Greece, and her father worried that if anyone married her, someone would try to kidnap her, to take her as a wife, and start a war. So Odysseus, who reportedly didn't think he had a chance anyway, came up with a scheme of having everyone swear that they would defend Helen's husband. That meant none of the suitors would dare steal her, because who would be stupid enough to have all of Greece declare war on them over a woman? Paris. Paris would be that stupid. Although, to be completely fair, I'm not sure that Paris was actually aware of this whole oath thing. He wasn't one of the original suitors. He received Helen essentially as a gift from Aphrodite for naming her as more beautiful than either Hera or Athena. Now, there is something that I think is really interesting if you look at the timeline here. Helen gets married around the age of 14. 10 years after that, she goes to Troy with Paris. And then, depending on which sources you take, it's between 10 and 18 years until the Iliad starts. And that makes Helen in her mid-30s or early 40s. So for the ladies out there, just want to say stay confident, because Homer is still calling her a young maiden. Anyway, we'll talk more about Helen a bit later. For now, we're talking about Paris. And Paris is the worst. We get a 20-line rant from Hector just about how awful Paris is. And remember, Hector is his brother. And this starts with, "Would that you were never born or died unwed," and ends with Hector suggesting that the Trojans should have stoned Paris to death. The clincher is that Paris responds by agreeing that Hector's analysis of his character is entirely fair. However, Paris is not a complete coward, and he agrees to go back out and actually fight Menelaus in single combat to end the war. And both sides are very clear that this fight will end the war. This isn't about finding out who is favored by the gods or who is in the right. It's really just an excuse to stop the fighting. And an excuse it is, because Paris has no chance in this fight. He actually has to borrow someone else's armor just in order to participate. It's basically suicide. While someone is sent to find Priam, the ruler of Troy, so that he and Agamemnon can swear the necessary sacred oaths to make this single combat legally binding, we're introduced to Helen. She is in a shitty position right now. The only person in Troy less popular than Paris is Helen, since she is partly the cause of the war. The goddess Iris takes her up onto the battlements, where the old men are gossiping like cicadas. They make the incredibly stupid comment that Helen is so beautiful that no one can really blame the Trojans or the Achaeans for going to war over her, which, given that they don't have to fight in the war, really makes them pretty awful. Fortunately, Priam himself is a decent guy, and he even tells Helen that he doesn't consider the war to be her fault. Priam blames the gods. Interestingly, he needs Helen on the battlements because he doesn't know who anyone is. That is not a detail that occurred to me when I was thinking about the Iliad. Since there's no photography or mass communication, Priam doesn't have any way of knowing exactly who each person is unless he has met them personally. Also, he's old and they're kind of far away. It would be pretty embarrassing to go swear a sacred oath and accidentally walk over to Ajax just because he's taller than Agamemnon. We learn from this conversation that the Trojan War is not as hasty a conflict as it is usually portrayed. When Helen points out Odysseus, Priam recalls that he did in fact meet him once before. Odysseus and Menelaus came to Troy in peace to negotiate for Helen's return, although Priam doesn't say why he refused them. Interestingly, he describes Odysseus like this. When resourceful Odysseus rose to speak, he would first stand, and fixing his eyes on the ground would raise his gaze from time to time, and he did not gesture with his staff back and forth, but held it without moving, like an ignorant man. You would think him to be surly and some mere simpleton, but when he let go, the great voice from his chest and words were like snowflakes in winter. Then no other mortal man could rival Odysseus. That is an almost textbook description of a man who we would today describe as autistic. Odysseus does not generally seem to have autistic traits, and Greek mythology isn't really known for its character consistency anyway, but it seems that Homer must have based this on someone who was. Helen points out a few more of the Achaean leaders, but then wonders where her brothers Castor and Pollux are. They had saved her from being kidnapped by the hero Theseus as a child. Like I said, Greek mythology not really known for its character consistency. But she tells herself that the reason Castor and Pollux are not there is because they are too ashamed of her to show up. In fact, Homer informs us that both have died. What he leaves out is that they were both killed while trying to steal cows for unclear reasons. Helen, I should point out, is one of the only characters capable of any real self-reflection. Perhaps Homer saw that as a feminine trait. Speaking of this, one point of debate about Helen is whether she came to Troy willingly or was kidnapped. The majority of ancient sources agree that Helen came with Paris out of either love or lust. In the Iliad, she remarks to Priam that, "I followed your son here, abandoning my marriage chamber and kinsman." And the poet Sappho, who is nearly a contemporary of Homer's, definitely saw it as voluntary. And then Ovid, who was writing much later, also agreed. The only work of the era that might give us a detailed view of the event is the Cypria, which served as a prequel to the Iliad, although it almost certainly wasn't written by Homer. Unfortunately, almost all of that text has been lost, except for summaries of the events, which don't specify what happened in any greater detail. What we haven't mentioned is the possibility that Homer is not a trustworthy source, however. There are two reasons why we might want to consider this. First is that the Greeks considered the Trojan War to be historical, and not all Greek writers agreed with Homer's account of the war. The second reason is that from the point of view of modern literary criticism, every author writes with a specific point of view and agenda, and thus shouldn't be considered entirely trustworthy. So, from a modern perspective, Homer may have written Helen as leaving her husband for another man simply because it reflects how he saw women. She is, after all, the only mortal woman of any real consequence to the story, and women being lustful and shallow is even the premise of the comedy Lysistrata by Aristophanes. It wouldn't be an unusual point of view for Homer to have, and so it wouldn't be unexpected for him to cast this personality on all women through Helen. Essentially, this view of the character encourages us to question why Homer chooses to write her the way that he does. It's not that he's somehow wrong, but rather that he wants us to react in a certain way, and we should be aware of that. But let's also talk about the historical perspective, because that is pretty wild. See, a lot of ancient sources insist that Homer was completely wrong about various details of the story. While they don't mention the matter of Helen's abduction specifically, many aspects of her part of the story are contested. In particular, Heterodotus and Philostratus say that Helen was in Egypt, and that throws into question everything that Homer writes about what happened to Helen. In their view, the actual events that the Iliad is based on were altered by Homer just to tell a better story. Now, I should mention that Heterodotus bases this claim on having seen a statue in Egypt that he thought looked like Helen, and Philostratus' source was a ghost. This was not really the era of hard-hitting investigative journalism, but it does mean that the idea of questioning what Homer wrote and why is not new. Perhaps Helen was kidnapped, but Homer felt it would make a better tragedy if she had left willingly. As for what Helen being in Egypt means to the story, both Heterodotus and Philostratus suggest that she was either sent there for safekeeping, that she and Paris were blown off course and he left her there where she would be safe, or that perhaps Hermes took Helen to Egypt for safekeeping and created a facsimile of her that was left at Troy. Either way, the idea is that the Trojans would have released Helen if they had her, so they must not have had her. Anyway, that digression should get me to the episode length that I'm aiming for. After Helen's conversation with Priam, we get to the actual swearing of the oath. This is an elaborate process. Priam and Agamemnon have water poured over their hands. Agamemnon cuts fleece from the sheep that they've brought, which is then distributed among the leadership of both sides. Then he makes a long prayer to Zeus that outlines the exact agreement which is being made. Next, the sheep are slaughtered, and everyone drinks the wine, and there is a final prayer made that if anyone breaks the truce, his brains should fall to the ground like wine, and his wife should be raped. With that out of the way, the single combat can begin. Interestingly, they draw lots for who gets to throw their spear first, rather than leaving that up to the fighters. It's decided that Paris will get the first shot. As the contest begins, Paris gets a direct hit on Menelaus' shield. It's not clear to me if that's a good thing or not, but it doesn't matter. The spear point bends. Menelaus goes next. His spear easily pierces Paris' shield and breastplate, though Paris is quick enough to dodge. The son of Atreus uses that moment to close the gap. His sword scythes downward, striking the ridge of Paris' helmet, but the blade shatters in his hands. Menelaus roars to the heavens in anger and seizes his foe by the horsehair crest of his helm. The strap chokes the Trojan prince, and the son of Atreus drags him toward the Achaean lines. The battle is decided. But then, Aphrodite intervenes, and she fucking teleports Paris back into his bedroom. Yeah, that took me slightly by surprise. In the first two chapters, the gods had a light touch. They were very indirect in the way that they interacted with mortals. This is where that starts to change. And if you're wondering, being forcibly teleported away by a god is considered a forfeit in ancient Greek ritual single combat. Of course, being Aphrodite, her first thought is that Paris needs his wife to take care of him. She takes the form of an elderly woman that Helen knew in Lacedaemonia, ancient Sparta, which for whatever reason goes unremarked upon. Anyway, despite the disguise, Helen recognizes Aphrodite by her breasts and her eyes. Helen's response is actually pretty amazingly badass. She tells Aphrodite that if Paris is really so great, then Aphrodite should just go fuck him herself. The goddess actually has to threaten Helen just to get her in the same room as her husband. As has already become a pattern for Paris, his conversation with his wife begins with her commenting that it would be great if he had died. Paris counters by suggesting that they have sex, and they do. Meanwhile, Menelaus is still stalking the battlefield, trying to find Paris. In fact, since Paris lost, all of the assembled Trojan soldiers are also looking for Paris, so they can turn him over to be killed and end the war. And so the chapter comes to the close. Next time on the Iliad, these ancient gods prove petty and cruel. Oh, and also, give me a like if you enjoyed the video, and if you disliked it, then hit that dislike button twice just to really let me have it. And of course, comments are always appreciated as well.